G'day folks, welcome to this playthrough of Scenario 4, the main campaign, the main battle from No Question of Surrender, the Battle for Bir Hacheim, which is published by Multi-Man Publishing. This is part of that grand tactical series which features other great titles like Where Eagles Dare, The Greatest Day and The Devil's Cauldron. This title was published in 2012, designed by Richardson. And it focuses on the French defence of that, that outpost, the southern flank of the Allied lines at this place called Bir Hacheim. It's in the middle of the desert, the site of an old Ottoman fort. And the French held out for several days, historically. In this game, you're basically trying to replay that. The Germans are trying to clear the French out from this area, clear the road, clear their supplies, and allow their offensive, part of that broader battle of Gazala, the Western Desert Campaign, to continue. So, as I said, this is Scenario 4, the main siege scenario, and at start the French set up their forces in certain areas of this perimeter. This is the area within which they'll mainly operate. The boundaries surrounding this are heavily mined. There are heavy minefields marked by red dots closely around the perimeter, and then scattered throughout the rest of the terrain are light minefields. And it's my understanding, I could be wrong here, that some Indian troops who pass through here and use this to really establish the fortifications here, set up those minefields by laying thousands of mines throughout the area. And in fact, I think thousands of those mines still remain to this day. This is really in the middle of the desert, south of Tobruk geographically. I think it's roughly 100 kilometres south of Tobruk, but it's on a main crossroads of these desert paths, leading sort of northwest to southeast and northeast to southwest. And historically, this was, as I said, the far southern flank of the Allied line, the southern flank of Rommel's attempt to drive through the 8th Army. So the French have to place their forces within this perimeter, within certain areas. They mainly have infantry. You can see the kind of blue and black units in the centre are their artillery. They do have an infantry reserve in the centre. Now the first turn I made a mistake, and I'm pointing this out now. It should have started with the Germans going first. They have their 90th Light Africa Division, and I simply made a mistake. I forgot to activate that counter. Instead, I drew a counter from the cup, and it was the Italians, and they have their 101st Motorised Division Trieste, and they're coming in from the northeast. So their movements are basically, I think it was a division activation, so they can't do any combat movements. It's just a case of slowly advancing towards the French. They can't move within French fields of fire, which brings them to a halt roughly in this position. They did begin in column, they rush the lines, and then they move out of column and begin to spread out throughout the desert, trying to avoid the minefields. In the south, when I remembered to activate the Germans, I made a pretty critical mistake here. As you can see, lots of column markers. My idea here was to rush through the desert. If they're in column, they can basically move at, these are mostly foot units, they can move one movement point per space. So my thinking was putting them in column, rushing through the desert, spreading them out so they don't, they're not a concentrated hex. And I was hoping to get to the French lines quickly. It looks a bit silly, and in hindsight it probably was, but that was my idea, just rushing towards the French lines. Now there are 3 different German formations here. There are 2 approaching in column from the southeast, as you can see on the right of that image, and I forgot about the 3rd, which is up in the east, in the top right of this image. Now I fix this up in just a moment. They get their little movement, which I should have done, and they come in to the east or the right of those French positions. You can see all those black dots. This is where the clear terrain is, the clear desert terrain. Everything else, it's hard to see those green dots, but they're the light minefields. The red dots are the heavy minefields. Now, at the start of the second turn, this is the 1500 turn on the 2nd of June, the French drew their direct command chit, and I thought, let's have a go at firing away with this artillery. They did activate the artillery in the first turn, but they didn't do much. They largely failed to make radio contact. So now in the 1500 turn, using this direct command, they spend some command points to activate their 4 artillery pieces in the centre. They all now have radio contact with forward observers among that French infantry. And as you can see by the heavy barrage markers, they pour quite heavy fire on those Germans as they advance. They roll very well in 2 cases, and they eliminate instantly 2 of these German infantry companies. They cause a cohesion hit on a third, and one of them the Germans had to roll for a suppression, which they passed. Nonetheless, they did quite a lot of damage there in those hexes. And here you get an overall view of the situation. Midway through that 1500 turn, this is around the point where I realised I forgot to move that other German formation, so they've just moved onto the field. Again, this is a division activation, so they can't move within the field of fire of any of those French units. So this is pretty much where they have to stop, and they then have to use a direct command or a formation activation before they can move further. And just again a close-up look at the situation. The Italians then got their division activation. It's the same again, they can't move within the field of fire. What I'm doing this first few turns is I'm trying to increase the dispatch points available to these sides. Unfortunately, I'm rolling quite high on those dispatch rolls, which means that well, the Italians, for example, only have 1 dispatch point, which isn't enough to put any of their formations into the cup. The Italians have to pay double, so it's at least 2 dispatch points to put a formation into the cup to draw. The Germans can pay 1, but again, they only have a small number of dispatch points, so I'm trying to save these up for later turns and use my command points to gradually advance. And just before the turn ends, the Germans get an activation, and very quickly they remove those column markers and begin to shift around those heavy barrage markers. They're splitting some of their forces. Some of them are moving around to the south, as you can see here. And so here's just an overview of the final situation at the end of that 1500 turn. The Axis forces moving very slowly, just using their division activations, trying not to use too many command points, trying to stay outside the firing range of those French units just for the time being. They're hoping to accrue some dispatch points, which they'll do in the following turn, moving very slowly and cautiously. Now, the 1700 turn begins with 2 consecutive French activations. The French get their division activation and then a direct command, and they use these mainly on their artillery. Their artillery has barraged, once again, those Germans out in the southeast. You can see the replacement of 3 heavy barrage markers. They're removed at the end of each turn. These 3 markers have just been placed after that French activation. And again, great success. They've eliminated 2 further German infantry companies. Again, whenever the Germans suffer a step loss, they have to roll, and in this case, they failed their roll, and so that entire formation down in the southeast withdraws for the day. They will re-enter the field as reinforcements the following day. That's a devastating blow for the Germans. They've already suffered 4 infantry company losses. Elsewhere, the Italians had an activation up in the north, and they're now spending some of their command points to move some of their key forces forward, moving some of their M1340 tanks forward, some of their anti-tank guns. The Germans are moving some of their mortars forward as well, and they're starting to harass the, I guess, the pointy end of those French defences. It's hard to see, but out in the northeast area, that French defensive line, they have managed to suppress 1 French unit. It's not much, but it's a start. Perhaps more importantly, these Italians and the Germans out in the east there are now in a good position to begin harassing the French more actively. Down the south, they're doing something similar, moving forward with the infantry. There's only 1 formation down here now, and this is being followed up by some of those German mortars, and they're also they're in range and are starting to harass the French. I should also mention, counter battery fire has been ineffective. The Italians and the Germans were successful in their opportunity to counter battery fire, but they in fact scored some hits, but they were suppression checks, and the French were very lucky. Great trip quality on these French artillery pieces, and they passed on every occasion. So no suppression or cohesion on those French. The French are also using opportunity fire where they can, but not managing any hits just yet. Okay, as we head into the 1900 turn, that basic broad axis plan continues. They're trying to advance with some of their armoured units. They've positioned their mortars just within range of those outskirts of the French defences. And over in the east, those German and Italian mortars can strike at that French anti-char gun, but it doesn't have the range to hit them back. But as you can see here, towards the end of this turn, they've advanced some of their armoured and anti-tank units to get a bit closer to those French. And they're starting to suppress and cause some cohesion hits. It's hard to see here, just on that far easternmost French unit. They did get a good opportunity fire, and they eliminated one of these French anti-tank units as they tried to dismount. So that's the one hit that the Germans have inflicted. The French artillery has been hitting the Germans mainly over in the east now. You can see mainly light barrage markers, one heavy barrage marker, causing some casualties amongst the Germans. They did suffer another 2 hits in this sector, including one on one of the German armoured units. And so the Germans have had to roll for that withdrawal, and they've passed on both occasions. Counter battery fire has not been great. You can see the one cohesion hit on one of those French artillery pieces in the centre of those defences. That's the only effective counter battery fire we've seen. So the German and Italian artillery hasn't done a lot. In the south, the Germans have slowly been advancing very slowly towards these French lines. And as you can see, they're moving some armoured units up within range of those French defences. So all they've been doing over this couple of hours has been just gradually advancing, trying to soften up the French defences before the German and Italian infantry gets too close. It is not really working. It's really hard to get these units into range before they get suppressed or lose cohesion hits or get eliminated outright. But in any case, this is the end of the turn. This brings us to the night turn at the end of the day. Okay, so this first night turn on the 2nd of June really helps the Axis powers. They can recover, they can rally more freely. Night visibility is limited to 3 hexes, which means a lot of the Germans and Italians are now outside the firing range, the firing visibility of a lot of these French units. They can free rally to recover suppression and some cohesion hits to a limitation. And they can begin to move more freely using their division activations towards those French units. Now, I think I've done this correctly. What I did was, you can see again in the far east, the French under a light barrage marker. I softened them up with some artillery to effectively blind them, limiting their visibility to 1 hex. Units under that light barrage marker, I think, only have range of 1 hex, which means that they can't see the Germans as they're approaching. So the Germans can use those division activation moves to advance more close to the French positions. There are still some other French in this area who can see the Germans, so they can't move too close. You can still see the anti-tank gun up in the north, which still has a range of 3 hexes, so they're right on the outskirts there. But what this does is it puts a lot of those stronger German and Italian anti-tank and armoured units with some direct high explosive armaments closer to those French. And down the south you can see a similar thing happening, but a bit more slowly. Some of the infantry units moving up, trying to get within range, or closer to the Germans while they can. A few of the Italian artillery pieces are now finally in radio contact. It's taken them a while. They've been engaging in counter battery fire, but they've finally done that. Some of those Germans are now in radio contact, so the Axis artillery is now slightly more active. Having said that, with the firing penalties during these night turns, there wasn't a lot of fire exchange taking place. It was really just the Axis using this opportunity to rally, recover, and really sneak more closely to the French lines. And they're going to be in a better position to begin to advance against the French on this next coming turn, the 3rd of June. That brings us to the end of the first day now. And despite some losses, what the Germans have really been doing is setting up their positions, advancing their armoured units, infantry following just behind, and they'll be ready to, I guess, explode from these lines on the 3rd of June, coming up soon. Okay, as we start the new day, the 3rd of June, the weather roll is a mist, which means that at least for the first few hours, turns, visibility is limited to 3 hexes, and there's a slight penalty for movement and for firepower. But this is again good for the Axis because it'll enable them to move closer to those French positions where they can't be seen or shot at. They can move around those firing ranges. The air power rolls were no effect, and I should have clarified at the night turn the French supplies arrived, so they are still at full supply. We haven't had an event yet either. We've had several event sheets drawn, but nothing has happened. So this turn is the same situation again. The Germans slowly pressing towards those French positions. Again, using their artillery to barrage those French on the outskirts, which prevents them from seeing the Germans, which then enables the Germans to advance unseen, even closer towards those French positions. The Italians got a bit too eager up in the north. They were trying really to advance towards the outskirts of those French positions, and they suffered some cohesion hits and a step loss, which again boosts French morale. In the south, you can see these Germans have really rushed on and sending out their armour in front, and they're very quickly able to move close to those French lines. The mist has effectively covered their advance, and they're now just 4 hexes from those French lines where they are getting ready to fire on the French. I should also mention the French rolled well on their dispatch, so they're now up to 7 dispatch points. The Germans were on 7, they rolled well, they spent 1, so they were on 8, they spent 1 to bring them down to 7, rolled well, and they're now back up to, in fact I think they're up to 10, sorry 9. So both the French and the Germans have accumulated these dispatch points, is what they wanted to do. Unfortunately, the Italians continue to roll poorly, and they're still only on 3, which again is just enough for them to activate 1 formation if they want to, which they're not going to do. They're going to hold on to it. Okay, so here's the situation at the end of the 0700 turn on the 3rd of June, and you may immediately notice that increasing density of barrage markers. The French are now using a lot more of their command points to activate their artillery and their mortars. Basically, this is indirect high explosives to target those Germans who are pressing against their defences. But also the Germans. They now have their spotters out with their formations. The Italians have some spotters out, so their artillery is being brought into action. They're now starting to increase the fire rate against these French positions. With those French positions under barrage markers, it provides the Germans with the opportunity just to press a little bit closer to those French lines. Again, this blinds the French, it obscures their fire range, and lets them move closer to those defences. So they're just outside those heavy minefields now. And that's the situation at the end of the 0700 turn. There was some effective counter battery fire by the Germans, which has suppressed one of those French batteries. And underneath these barrage markers among Germans, there's a lot of cohesion hits and suppression markers, so they are suffering in their advance, but they are gradually advancing towards these French lines. Okay, on the 0900 turn, the Germans have actually crossed those French defensive barriers and have entered Bir Hacheim. Down the south there, you can see under these barrage markers there was a German unit that did cross those defences. and they've entered these heavy minefields. Now, a very heavy French battery response has eliminated one of those German infantry companies, giving them a morale boost. But elsewhere, they're really right in the outskirts. All these suppressed markers among these German units you can see here are primarily caused by their attempts to enter these heavy minefields. Unfortunately, they've been rolling pretty poorly on their attempts. They basically need a 5 or more, a lot of 4 or lesses on their results to enter these heavy minefields. So they've all been sort of stopped short of these minefields, with a few exceptions. So that one in the south, which was eliminated, and up in the northeast you can see 2 German companies have advanced right next to that far eastern French position. Now, unfortunately for the Germans at this point, they've spent just about all their command points. They have 1 command point left, which they've held on to. Meanwhile, the French have quite a few command points left. They've got 9 up their sleeve. Sorry, they've got 5 up their sleeve, 9 dispatch points. The Italians are doing okay. They've got 9 command points and still very low 3 dispatch points at this stage. But the Germans doing okay with dispatch points. They're on 8, but yeah, down to 1 command point. So they're very limited in what they can do during these divisional activations now that they're approaching the French lines. They may need to... Having said that, they did spend some dispatch points, so next turn they will have 2 formation activations to play with. Okay, heading into the 1100 turn, and we had our first event of the scenario thus far. It was the 7th Motorised Brigade column relief. The German player must withdraw Kampfgruppe Volz formation, which is the purple formation which was down the southeast. So they've been removed for the rest of the day. They have only just arrived. They were on the road towards the front, so they haven't really taken part in much, but they were going to provide some heavy fire support for those Germans as they advanced in the southeast. So what's happening this turn is, once again, the Germans pressing through slowly. Again, the artillery barrage intensity is increasing. The Germans trying to blind the French trying to really harass the Germans. The French did again score a few hits on those German companies out the front, which is again increasing their morale. But the Germans are passing their withdrawal roll, so they're not having to withdraw these formations for the rest of the day. Some suppression markers again scattered throughout from these wheeled and tracked units as they try to make their way through the minefields, just to get closer to the French to improve their direct fire dice roll modifier. Only very minor, but often a lot of these units are at maximum range, so they're just trying to get a bit closer. The French in the background are shifting more of their garrison over to the east. They're only holding the west very thinly. It's pretty clear this is where the focus of the German and Italian attacks are, and that takes time. They've got a few mortar units behind the lines now and within range of those Germans at the front. But at this point, things are looking pretty good for the Germans. Yes, they've suffered some losses, but they're just about to hit the French, and they're doing so in pretty good strength. Okay, at the 1300 turn, German infantry is moving up against those French positions. No assaults yet this turn, but they're in a very good position to do so from the next turn. Unfortunately, a lot of those German armoured and anti-tank units are suffering from those minefields, a lot of suppression markers, as you can see. The Italians way up in the north suffering even more so. They've suffered a few step losses, a lot of suppression. They've lost a few of their weak infantry companies, and because of their low firepower, there's not much they can do up there in the north. So despite their low dispatch rating, I probably wouldn't even spend a dispatch point in anyway. I don't think they've scored any hits at all. Their mortars are good for laying light barrages, but that's about all they've been doing. And elsewhere, it's really just the Germans again laying this light. In one place, a lucky heavy barrage in the middle, which is suppressing those French defenders, but that was about it for this turn. The 1500 turn, however, was much more interesting, and immediately you may notice that big gap in the centre of the Axis lines. I'll explain that in a moment. So the Germans have now moved adjacent to a lot of these French positions. They were very successful with rallying this turn. They've really suffered from these minefields. They've been rolling terribly with these minefields. They've been struggling to rally. But this turn they were very successful in rallying. See, a lot of those suppression markers have been removed from a lot of those German units in particular. Unfortunately, the biggest problem for the Germans is they have such a low number of command points. They can't really activate a lot of these units. But they did get a formation activation on this turn, and they launched their first assault on the French positions. Up to this point, it's just been artillery and long-range direct fire. Now we have, and I'll show you a zoomed-in situation here, the first assault, this 8-155 company assaulting that suppressed French position under that light barrage just up in the left. Now, the Germans were very optimistic about this. Both these French units were suppressed. This is the anti-tank and an infantry company. They're both suppressed. They both had suffered cohesion hits. There's a combined 3 cohesion hits between them. So they're very weak. And the Germans went in here with full strength with no cohesion hits. Unfortunately, the French rolled pinpoint perfectly on their defensive assault fire, causing a hit on that German company, eliminating them. The Germans then failed their formation withdrawal check, and so that entire formation withdraws from the field of battle for the day. They'll re-enter next morning. So the Germans were feeling so optimistic, everything was going so well. They were looking at this assault thinking, yes, they're about to break through these lines, they're about to eliminate 2 French units, including an anti-tank unit. And it was just that pinpoint accurate French roll, which just amazing odds. And yeah, finding that withdrawal, they've withdrawn. There's a big gap in the German lines now. But and the Italians can't do much up in the north. They're terrible on the attack. Relying really now on the Germans in the south for the remainder of this day, with the German reinforcements to arrive in the following day. So they've taken all this time, slowly moved up to the French lines. It's taken them effectively almost a full 24 hours to gradually move up behind this artillery barrage, to finally launch their first assault, which they hope will be the first of many, and then they've just disappeared from the field of battle. So it's a bit frustrating for the Germans, but the French have breathed a sigh of relief on this second day. Okay, in the 1700 turn there's this intense exchange of artillery fire down in the south sector, where the Germans are trying to move up against these French defensive positions. But again, every time the Germans move in and they try to get close to the French really target those most advanced German infantry companies with artillery, just focus their fire, and they are hitting very frequently. So because of the troop quality improvement, because of their firepower improvement, it has become very easy for the French artillery to eliminate these Germans. The Italians up in the north aren't really doing much. Now in the 1900 turn, as I just said, the Italians aren't doing much, but they're still trying to press closer to the French. Their firepower is so low, but they're using their mortars to kind of lay barrages. In the south, there are very few German infantry companies left. I think there might be 1 or 2 left in this area. The French artillery has just been focusing overwhelmingly on the German infantry. And all that the Germans have left here, as you can see, is the sort of anti-tank guns and flak and a few mortars and so forth. Now things start to change on the night turn of the 3rd of June. The Italians start to behave a bit more aggressively. They've built up their dispatch points, they've built up their command points, and they're really starting to hit the French up in the north. At the same time, the Germans are changing their tactics in the south. Rather than trying to move up their, well, they've got no infantry left, so rather than try and use their infantry, they're really using their command points for the first time to focus on single French units, and gradually building up those cohesion hits. Because they can't cause an instant hit or an elimination result on these entrenched French defenders, they have to gradually build up cohesion and suppression hits. And that's what they're now doing, that's what they're now focusing on to try to eliminate these French. Rather than try to move in and assault and capture this ground, they're just popping away with this flak and these anti-tank guns, and for the first time, they're actually having some success in this area. Now, the problem here is that yes, there's a lot of German armour, and yes, they've got some good firepower ratings, but there's no infantry to support them. There's no infantry to move in and capture this ground. These armoured, tracked, and a few wheeled units have gradually made their way through the minefields, but yeah, there's no infantry to support them in this. Now I'll show you the casualty totals in just a moment. You can see how bad it's been for the Germans. Here you can see all their infantry losses from those two camp groups in the south in particular. The problem for the French is they've lost 3 of their anti-tank guns, they've lost a machine gun, and only 1 infantry unit thus far. But here we go. There is a big change in the following day on the 0500 turn of the 4th of June. The Italians get a few activations. They also start to assault those French lines. They've suppressed the French. They are now firing their mortars, and again they're focusing on that idea of just building up those cohesion hits on that single unit. And they had some success in the north. They've eliminated a French unit up in the north. In the south, the Germans, doing the same thing, have eliminated 2 French units on this turn. That's a total, 3 dead French units is a total of negative 15 morale for the French, which is quite powerful. So if I can just contrast with the, I'll show you the casualty results at the end of this turn, you can see there are quite a few more French losses, including the sappers. They weren't too strong, but another French infantry unit as well. So now that the Germans and the Italians are doing this, I think they're beginning to shift the odds back in their favour. There are 2 new camp groups coming in as reinforcements this turn. They'll charge down the road. And yeah, the French without the anti-tank guns might be in a bit of trouble. We'll see how things go. Well, by 0700 the situation has really deteriorated rapidly for the French. There was an event chit drawn and activated that severed the communication ties between the French artillery and their spotters. So those 4 key French guns are now out of contact with their spotters and can't fire. And when they tried to reinitiate contact, they all failed their contact rolls. Down the south, this German strategy of what they've been doing is focusing their direct fire guns, their flak, AT, on 1 French unit at a time, suppressing and slowly building up these cohesion hits. And by doing that, they've been getting step losses and then unit eliminations. And it's by that process that they're gradually clearing out the French from this area. So within 1 or 2 turns, they've killed close to half a dozen French units. They've been struggling for the first 24, 48 hours, and now all of a sudden they've moved through the minefields. They're in a good position. They've cleared out those French anti-tank guns from most of these areas. There are 2 still remaining in the far north and the far sort of west. But the Germans have a lot of freedom in this area to, as you can see from this image, to really target those isolated French units, including the French infantry. So things looking very bad for the French at the end of this turn. Now, it all comes to a head on the 1100 turn. French morale was on 9 at the end of that last turn. During this turn, it dropped to 0, which triggered effectively the end of the game, the French withdrawal. You can see here, they've just driven, the Germans in the south, they have driven straight through that gap they've created. They drove straight to the French artillery in the centre there, assaulted that artillery and eliminated the French defenders. That, in addition to some step losses elsewhere, forced that French morale down to 0. And as a result of that, the French will have to withdraw during today's night turn. However, because it's just the 3rd day of the game, the 4th of June, it's effectively an automatic Axis victory. So I'm not going to play through the rest of the turns because it's there's nothing the French can do to save themselves in this case. So that's effectively the end of scenario 4, Axis victory. And thinking back over what's happened, the French really dominated with their artillery. They just completely destroyed the vast bulk of German infantry. There are maybe one or two Italian infantry companies left, but most of those Germans, if not all of those Germans that started on the map, have been destroyed, primarily via French artillery fire. If they get their company bonus, with their bonus firepower from shooting within the area of Bir Hacheim, they get a firepower of 7, so they need a 0 to 7 to do some damage. And 4 of those 8 possibilities cause a hit or eliminate the target. So on a 0, 5, 6 or 7, they'll eliminate the target, and that's about a 40% chance of success. Now, because of their improved troop quality ratings, it means they can very easily get that, well, more easily get that company bonus and more easily get that stronger firepower. And that was one of the reasons why these Germans were losing so much of their infantry. The counter to that is that the French weren't targeting the German guns and wheeled and tracked units, so all their anti-tank and artillery units remained pretty healthy. By that third day, there was no German infantry anywhere near the French, and the Germans were only using their direct high explosive against the French. So it's got me thinking what the point of the infantry is if they're so both fragile, can't be protected, and are so easily destroyed in these situations. It really all came down to these armoured units. It was the armoured Germans against the entrenched French. And because the Germans only need to inflict a few casualties on the French to reduce their morale, once they kind of realised that, once they had their armoured units close enough to hit the French, they just focus on that. Now, they weren't getting instant hits or eliminations. They were getting suppression results and cohesion hits, and they were gradually building these up over a series of direct and indirect fires on these French. So they'd pick one unit and they'd just focus all their fire on that one unit. It'd be suppressed, it'd be get a cohesion hit, another cohesion hit, and then a step loss, and then an elimination. That's 5 hits to destroy it, and that's -5 morale. Now, yes, the French were inflicting far more casualties on the Germans, but it ultimately didn't matter, because all those German losses account for nothing when victory is determined, which is very interesting. I mean, there's no German infantry on the map. Way down the far southeast, some have just arrived with reinforcements, but there are none close to the French, and yet they've dominated the field. The French didn't do much movement. They were trying to shift their reinforcements over to the east. They were worried if they shifted everything over, the Germans would move around quickly and outflank them and move into the defences from the west. So they did keep some defences out in the western side. But once the Germans get close enough, if the French leave their entrenchments, they're subject to opportunity fire. So there wasn't a lot of French movement. Instead, they used all their command points, wherever possible, on that artillery activation to great effect in terms of destroying the German infantry. What else could they have done? They perhaps... good question. They perhaps could have barraged some of these German armoured units more effectively. Although, if you go through, you can see there's a lot of barrage markers on them. They're doing that as much as they could. Perhaps they could have targeted the German armour more than the infantry. Instead of trying to destroy all that German infantry, maybe try and disrupt, suppress and get some cohesion hits and possibly some hits on those German armoured units out the front. But there are just so many of them. If you look at that final image of the map, there are so many German armoured units out there. And again, it takes sort of a suppression, 2 cohesion hits before they start to take step losses. So it's hard to do that. Look, having said all that, it's a fascinating game. It really felt like an artillery duel. I think this This No Question of Surrender really emphasises the role of artillery in these battles. Barely a small arms shot was fired. The French infantry, I'm pretty sure, never fired a shot. The Germans got close enough to launch maybe 1 or 2 assaults. The Italians tried to launch an assault, and most of those assaults failed. There was only that one final assault that succeeded against the French guns, but every other assault was a disaster. It was really the artillery dominating the field. The French artillery, first of all, dominated the Germans, and then, the German direct high explosive, not quite artillery, but they finished off those French in the end. But having said all this, fascinating game, fascinating playthrough, highly recommended again. Looking forward to the next GTS title.